What this presentation is for this half hour is the second part of good housekeeping measures. We're going to talk about some drip protection, material storage, stock and spoil pile protection, portable toilets, and solid waste. Say, well, that's kind of nitpicky. Well, we can have some real problems in these areas. One of the things I look for when I do an inspection is I look for drip pads or pans in the appropriate places under equipment. I used to say under idle equipment. I'm now clarifying that, say idle and static equipment, and you understand why as we go on forward. The drip protection needs to be under the appropriate place on the equipment, not under the left rear wheel of the dump truck unless there's a leak in that axle. I will check equipment in use. As I walk by, I'm always looking underneath to see if there are any active leaks. Just about every SWIP out there will say that if you have leaking equipment, it's to be removed from the site and repaired. It should not be in use is the bottom line. See if spill kits are readily available. Check stationary cranes for drip pads. These things may be in use, but they're in a static location. You pop a hydraulic line on one of those, you have seconds to react, especially if you're near or over water. Check for protection in place if maintenance is being done. These are some examples of pans and pads. You have a lot of different variations. We're going to talk a little more about what I call the cookie sheet pan. But you have everything from drip pads to kind of a scroll equipment. We'll talk about that a little bit. Here's an example of a very large site where the spill kit is readily available. I call these cookie sheet pans. Inside the yellow circle, it actually says drip pan. These things are very light. They have a very shallow capacity. They only survive one drive over. And I'm sure all of you know that drip pans get run over all the time on a construction site. These things are primarily designed for warehouses and motor pools. You have to be very careful about getting them extremely level on the site. Cranes. These things are normally in operation, but they're in a static condition. Now I chose this particular picture, even though the drip pad in front of it needs some work, is because let's see if I can get this pronunciation right. Manitowoc crane. Some of the old ones have a unique problem. There is an oil pan under the crane that when it fills with water, you're now leaking oil. That's why this particular old lady has a kiddie pool under there, and you can see it over there, with oil-absorbent cloth in it. This crane was positioned in a very rainy area, so they did have that continued problem. Paving equipment needs some extra special care. It's one of the few things that in the manual it says you will provide drip protection. And this is not just under the oil or the engine block. You need it under the hopper where the asphalt goes, and you need it under the roller assembly. Because what happens when it rains, you have had petroleum-based product in those hoppers, and you end up with an oil slick running out the back of the paving equipment. You need to make sure your drip protection is big enough so that the operators can hit it. especially the distribution trucks. This thing, I can tell on a site everywhere where your distributor truck has been parked because there's a line of tack coat. We use the fabric over the plastic on most of our projects. This thing has very minimal absorbent capability. When it gets saturated, it needs to get changed. Because what happens is it will just filter the pollutant. This is a method that I saw Grace Pacific use first. This is one of the few times I'll tell you which company. What they did is they created a scroll type thing. It's got a barrier fabric. It's got absorbent fabric on top of it. They stapled some 2x to it, or 2x4s, and you can roll it up and put it on the equipment for when it moves down the road. The only thing you have to add on this is if you're using this sort of protection and you're parking for any great length of time, you need to add the berm down slope. Let's talk about construction material storage. You need to store under cover and containment. Store your materials away from discharge points. The biggest thing is you need to prevent contact with rainwater, and we'll talk about some very, very specific examples of this. One of the things you'll find showing up in your SWIPs is that they specifically mention rebar and galvanized steel. The rust and the corrosion on these items are considered a point source of pollution. Rebar. It needs to not come in contact with rainwater. All this is covered in Appendix C of HAR 1155. It doesn't specifically mention rebar, but trust me, DOH looks at your rebar and your galvanized steel. The top picture shows the rebar nicely racked off the ground, but it's not covered. If you're lucky enough to be near the viaduct can be used as your cover, unless you have a covered storage containment area. Otherwise, you need to cover it with plastic. You can also put things in the general storage areas. These two areas that you see on the left are actually also used for hazardous material. They have lips to prevent pollution of anything that's running off. The reason you cover metal containers or you store them on an angle to prevent rainwater from collecting is because they will rust. This particular container had stuff in it. I don't know what kind of stuff, but it had stuff in it. Excuse me. Stockpiles and spoil piles. Oh dear. When I look at these, I will check for cover, especially if it has fines. If I go to projects and they have their base course sitting out there in a pile, I say, but it's rock. I will pick up a handful and drop it. If dust comes off of that, oh, excuse me. If dust comes off of that, it needs to be covered. You need to check where the pile is placed. It should not be placed in a stream bed, and I have found piles in stream beds. It should not be close to water. The cover is both for wind and water erosion. Very few piles are too big to cover. The bottom picture in this area up here was kind of too big to cover. What they did is they hydromulched it with tactifier. That prevents wind erosion. I've got water. The perimeter protection needs to be appropriate. This particular slide shows some erosion control matting that was rolled up and placed right at the base of the pile. If you're putting perimeter protection, it should be removed from the pile a foot or two to allow ponding underneath it. Now, most people, when they cover with plastic, are setting the biosock on the edge of the plastic. If the pile is completely covered, that's probably okay. Let's talk about portable toilets. They're light. They can blow over in the rain, in the wind. The slide at the top, I don't know if you can see it from the distance. That portable toilet is laying on its back. The contractor was very fortunate. They had just serviced it the day before. It had a trap in it. We could open and see that nothing had spilled out. They need to be secured from tipping over. If you can put them in an area where they're not affected by wind, that might be secure enough. If not, you need to secure them. Either tie them down or stake them down. You also need to consider where you're placing your toilet. The one on the bottom left is not in a good location. We got huge pieces of equipment moving through the site. You don't want them running over these things. They should also not be next to drains or waterways. These things tip over, you got a sewage spill, not a discharge. Different rules, different problems. As I said, you can stake them down or tie them down. Now, some of the toilets on the skids have a hole in it. Just stick a forming stake down through that. Solid waste. Most times if I use this, it's because the trash bins are not covered. But there are other exceptions. Biggest problem that I find is on dealing with scaffolding and waterways and drainage structures. And that's because of the forming work. If you cover your trash bin, you need to use plastic. This is because you're guarding against leaking from that trash out onto the ground. If you're close to the viaduct, put it under the viaduct. There has been at least one contractor that created a sliding cover. Thank you. Never a good time, folks. Scaffolding, especially over waterways. The picture on the left did not have any kickboards. It didn't have any biosock. A lot of nails. They even ended up in the stream bed. This was in impaired waters. One way around this is to put in the kickboards, biosocks, snake bags, to prevent the debris from going into the waterway. If you're doing grinding operations or concrete operations, you might want to consider fabric and plastic to prevent it from going over the side. One of the biggest problems we find out there is where you're doing a lot of forming work. The forming guys might be good at form work, but a lot of times they don't think about where they're leaving their scrap. For instance, here, the yellow circles are scrap that migrated from the inlet side. This is the outlet side in a dry stream bed that does run water. The bottom, they left it in an interceptor ditch in a rainy area. The top, one of the few places they could find for the workbench was just before an inlet. You'll find a lot of sawdust, scrap lumber, everything else up there. And we all know we have heavy rains that come on us very suddenly. Are there any questions? Let me add one thing on stock spoil piles. There is one exception that we have to covering with plastic. It's got to be plastic, except if you're bringing in landscaping mulch. You do not cover that with plastic because it is a heat source underneath there with the continual decay of the mulch. And there you can cover it with fabric.